Hey, today I will be talking about retrograde planets and hopefully explain this well. A planet is retrograde when it appears to be moving backwards in the zodiac, as seen from the Earth. It can be compared to the effect of a slow-moving train as viewed from another train traveling parallel to it, but at a more rapid rate, wherein the slower train appears to be moving backwards. When it comes to celestial bodies, it is not a matter of their actual speed or travel, but of the rate at which they change their angular rulership. In astrology, this condition is or was considered a debility, weakening the action of the planet over human affairs and disease. Now, this is because it denotes a solution of continuity, interrupted sequence, the same as direct motion of a planet indicates continuity of influence. For example, in health matters, a planet turning retrograde indicates a change in the sickness or disease, a possible breaking up and disorganization of the ailment, while that same ailment or disease may continue strong as long as the afflicting planet remains direct and rapid in motion. Planets are not as forceful over the life when retrograde at birth, and usually individuals born with many retrograde planets could have weaker constitution, more trouble in life, or less energy. However, it is said that these same individuals with retrograde planets at birth, and let me just say here, it does not have to be many planets. I have noticed this even if you have one or two retrograde planets, just depends which ones, have a direct spiritual effect on the life, which in the end often leads to greater success by soul growth than when the nature is more dominated by merely materialistic ambitions. Retrograde planets tend to give intuitional or intuitive powers greater rule rather than reason and intellect. Again, this will vary depending on the planet. The Sun and Moon are never in retrograde motion as seen from the Earth. However, the Moon is said to be equivalent to a retrograde planet when slow in motion and moving less than 13 degrees in the course of 24 hours. Even though retrograde planets were by the ancients said to be weak or debilitated, more logical interpretation would or could seem to indicate that the influence is stronger, which in the case of, let's say, a malefic planet, could potentially be more unfortunate. That it continues to retrograde for a period after birth might detract from its capacity to incite progress, but if so, the extent of backwardness or slowness must be judged from its relative nearness to its second station. Some astrologers say, or they said, that the planet in retrograde motion partakes of the nature of Mars's end of spectrum. Now, this, of course, is not a safe notion or concept, for according to the laws of the spectroscopy, which is in narrower contexts, precise study of color as generalized from visible light to all bands of the electromagnetic spectrum. So according to this, a planet moving away from us, so the distance increasing between the planet and the Earth, produces a slight shift of frequencies toward the red end of spectrum, hence Mars. And with the diminishing distance, a relative shift towards the red end begins immediately after the opposition of a major planet to the Sun and continues until just before the conjunction. And that can hardly be said to apply at all to a minor planet. It would seem that consideration of this factor involves the direction of the planet's motion, whether toward or away from the Earth, rather than the character of the motion as either direct or retrograde. And in fact, this may seem to have bearing on the doctrine of orientality. Now, this Doppler displacement or shift, and this is a change in frequency of a wave in relation to an observer who is moving relative to the wave source. Example, a change in the pitch of train horn as it gets closer and recedes from to someone standing at rest. Or in astronomy, this effect is used when observing the red shift of galaxies in space to determine their velocity. So this has been noted in observations of Venus, which indicated that a differentiation of influence should be studied as between Venus when in motion away from the Earth and when moving toward it. Now, who remembers Sheldon from Big Bang Theory and his Halloween costume, where he dressed as the Doppler effect, demonstrating it by using that sound and changing his pitch? And nobody understood who he was, and after people thought he was either a train or some kind of disorder, Leonard asked him if he could just say that he was a zebra, which of course Sheldon refused. Now, that show is so good, but moving on. If we analyze the cycle of Mercury as typical of the orbits of the minor planets, It shows this succession of the phenomena, first being superior conjunction when it passes on the far side of the sun in direct motion, at which time it is invisible. After that, it rises after the sun and remains invisible during the daylight hours, and it becomes visible only after the sun has set in the west, becoming evening star. About 15 days after the superior conjunction, it is at its smallest, a small circular orb. About 6 months later, it reaches the greatest elongation east, the point of the greatest distance ahead of the sun in its counterclockwise direct motion in orbit. At this time, it passes out of its gibbous phase, showing only half of its surface illuminated, yet seemingly larger and brighter because it comes closer to Earth. Around 2 weeks later, it enters the arc over which it will shortly retrograde, so enters retrograde arc. Even though reduced to a crescent of illumination, it still appears larger, and with its elevation, it remains longer above the horizon and is at its greatest brilliance. Now, after 2 weeks, it becomes stationary. This is first station in preparation for retrograde motion. And in another 2 weeks, about 6 days before the inferior conjunction, it becomes a slender crescent. Inferior conjunction happens when it passes in retrograde between the Earth and Sun and is lost from sight in Sun's rays. And this conjunction is shorter in duration and they separate faster because Mercury's motion is opposite to the apparent motion of the Sun. In another 5 days, it again becomes visible on the other side of the sun, the west, when as the morning star, it appears before sunrise as a slender crescent, but turned in the opposite direction. Now, in another 6 days, it again becomes stationary in preparation to resume its direct or redirect motion. About 15 days later, it is reduced to a broad crescent and is again at its brightest, now as a morning star. As it advances beyond the degree of its first station, it leaves the retrograde arc and enters territory over which it will not retrograde during the cycle. Now, although no longer in retrograde, it has not yet accelerated to the extent that it equals the sun's motion. So it continues to increase behind the sun in elongation and elevation for about 10 or 12 days to the point of greatest elongation or elevation west just before it commences its gibbous phase. Around 7 months later, 15 days before the superior conjunction, it decreases in visible size until it appears as a small but fully illuminated disk of less than 1/3 the diameter it had at its brightest phase. Then comes the next superior conjunction and invisibility, completing one cycle from one superior conjunction to the next. Venus's motion is similar, though her intervals are longer, so the Mercury sidereal period is approximately 88 days long, and its synodic period is 116 days, and the Venus orbit is 225 days and has a synodic period of 584 days. The cycle of the major planets is not very different, except that at the opposition, the Sun and the planet are on the opposite sides of the Earth. While the inferior conjunctions with a minor planet and the oppositions to the major planet always occur during the retrograde, the similarity ceases when gravitation is considered. Since at the opposition of the major planet, the Earth is in between, so the planet and the Sun are exercising a gravitational pull upon the Earth from opposite sides, while at both conjunctions of a minor planet, the gravitational pull from the Sun and the planet are always in the same direction. It is generally considered that a transiting planet is more likely to develop its negative qualities when in retrograde. The fact it is turning back for a recheck of ground already covered should not be necessarily bad, except for the fact that the future is held in a state of dormancy or in suspension. Now, some people may look upon any delay as a sort of tragedy, but the real difference has to do with those whose neck is in the noose. A noose is a loop in the end of the rope. So when the postponement of execution is decreed. In some cases, it may mean only a temporary delay that is compensated for when the planet resumes in its direct motion. As for Mars, this proximity of Mars to the Earth may be one of the most important of considerations, since it considerably augments the strength of its reception, the signal strength. Some speak of Mars retrograde as Mars perigee and attribute to it a wave of robberies, calamities, and vicious murders. Mars was closest to Earth in August 1924, then in 2003, and this closeness is not to be matched until 2287. In 2082, it is going to get close, but not that close. The period of slower motion and of increasing intensity when the transiting planet is approaching its first station, and of slower but accelerating motion after it passes its second station, are important arcs, because any birth planet which falls within the arc over which the transiting planet will retrograde will receive 3 separate and successive accents of the combined nature of the radical and the transiting planet. When Mars in transit retrogrades over a Saturn's birth position, it means that this is already the second transit of Mars over the birth Saturn position, and that when it resumes redirect motion, there will occur a third contact. If a contact should be expected to manifest or crystallize into an event, then 3 contacts can mean 3 events. So even if one resists the temptations, 3 is obviously harder than 1, especially 3 slow ones that linger and burn or even scar more deeply. There is the further and important consideration of declination to be taken into account, and a parallel of latitude reinforcing the first or third contact may render one of them more effective even than the retrograde contact. So it would appear that the important differentiation of a transiting planet's influence requires the dividing of its apparent orbit into 2 arcs, the one over which the planet will travel across once, and that which it will traverse 3 times in one cycle. Now these 2 arcs were termed the arc of advance and the arc of retrograde. And this distinction emphasizes the fact that it is not merely the slow motion of retrograde which is involved, or the matter of replacing steps over territory previously traversed or crossed, but there will be 3 separate contacts with each degree within the arc of retrograde, as compared to 1 brief contact with each degree within the arc of advance. Because of that, the arc of retrograde is marked by 4 points: the pre-first station point at which the arc begins, when it first passes the degree which later marks the second station, then the first station where the motion turns retrograde, after that the second station where the motion turns direct, and lastly the post-second station point where the arc ends, marked by the passing of the degree of the first station. A further consideration is in the fact that with the major planets, the opposition to the Sun occurs always in the middle of the arc of retrograde, while the conjunction occurs in the middle of the arc of advance. Also that at the opposition, the Earth is nearer to the planet by the length of the diameter of its own orbit. This is for the reason that at any planet's opposition to the Sun, the Earth is between that planet and the Sun, while at the conjunction, the Earth is on the far side of the Sun opposite the planet. In the case of minor planets, the Earth never passes between them and the Sun, so they never opposition the Sun. But the superior conjunction, which occurs when the Earth and the planet are on opposite sides of the Sun, falls in the middle of the arc of advance, and the inferior conjunction, when the planet passes between the Earth and the Sun, is halfway in the arc of retrograde. Now, after I have complicated this topic, let me say that with retrograde planets, problem is not in the difficulty they may pose as people seem to see them, but in the unwillingness to accept it as a teaching device, as it is so easy to blame fate or external circumstances when something goes wrong. Normally, all of us think that the conscious mind should be in control, but that is not what retrogression is or what retrograde planets are teaching us. If you want to use this astrological model to its full potential, then it is important to listen what it has to say. So when Mercury is retrograde and something important is calling for awareness, and that particular something will emerge from the unconscious through the agency of Mercury. And here we uncover that life is a discovery, not a design. Seems that a lot of people invoke Murphy's Law, everything that can go wrong will go wrong during the Mercury retrograde period. Like everything will fall apart and then, I guess, by magic, be right when Mercury returns to its direct motion. It does not work that way. Any information, event, fact, or awareness that Mercury surfaces within the course of the retrograde cycle is completely within the character and relevant only to the needs of the individual. And while we stand on the personal level, individuals who experience Mercury retrograde, this motion affects series of houses in the chart that are occupied by the signs of that element. So that makes it a lot more complicated. And I will touch upon Venus retrograde, which was known even to the Aztec and Maya civilizations. The phase between the station retrograde and station direct of Venus bear the greatest relevance. Venus is retrograde in the same sign every 8 years. And in its pattern, which is known today as the pentagram or petals of Venus, and it also forms the basis of the golden section ratio, there are implications of hidden generative powers. So retrograde Venus can be a pure treasure and not what is usually read, especially on the internet. With that being said, to be born in either of the stations, retrograde or direct, it signifies a powerful connection with the interior mechanism of the golden section. The nature of these individuals is highly imaginative and must find way to externalize the metaphysical through the physical. And in transit, something almost mysterious takes place, a reformulation of natural order, a return to an ideal place. Because of the pattern of 5, this is essentially connected with the idea of making, building, forming or structuring, bringing together things that are naturally separate into a formal relationship with one another. Venus retrograde people often have a sense of being complete within themselves, of being autonomous and independent from the worldly design of senses, values, and relationships. And also a specific androgynous feature, either psychological or physical, is notable with these individuals, which, for example, can mean men are more in touch with their feminine instincts and women are more connected with their masculine animus. And I will stop here today. Retrograde planets should be looked upon as blessings of a sort, something that these planets are stronger than direct ones. Individuals born with them have some sort of mission and may have stronger personalities. In a way, retrograde planets allow you to see past karmas, so to say, and they may change your life accordingly. Now, if you're very interested in this topic, I may in the future make videos about retrograde planets in signs and in houses. But in the meantime, you can leave a comment below asking a specific question about a retrograde planet or retrograde planets you may have, or just write if they had any effect on you in your life and what was it. A quote for today is by Helen Adams Keller. She was an American author and educator who overcame deafness and blindness. She lost her sight and her hearing when she was 19 months old, and she said, "No pessimist ever discovered the secret of the stars, or sailed to an uncharted land, or opened a new doorway for the human spirit." Thank you for being here today. Please subscribe, press the like button, and I will be seeing you in a couple of days. Bye.